been a weird sort of a week. I don't think I need to tell anyone how weird a week it's been this week. Every part of our lives, we've had to adapt to a new way of living. There's fear, there is confusion, there's frustration, there's laughter, there are memes, which is essentially how I've got through the last week and how I'm aiming to get through the next weeks and months to come. But there are also opportunities to do things differently, opportunities to step out of our comfort zones even as we retreat into our houses and our homes, opportunities to connect and to care differently. There's potential to live in new ways. There's potential to share our faith in new ways, maybe even to be more bold in how we share our faith. And that is a really exciting thing for us, I think. I was in the queue at the bank on Wednesday, keeping a safe distance from the people in front, obviously. And I overheard part of a conversation between a woman and the teller in the bank. And she was a typical sort of wee Glasgow wifey. And she said to the teller in that Glasgow wifey kind of a way, "All the churches are shutting down." And two things really struck me about what she was saying. Firstly, she seemed disappointed that that was the case. I don't know if she was a woman of faith or not, but she was surprised and she was disappointed about this. The second thing though, and this is the thing that really hit me about it, was I know that what she said isn't true, but she didn't. Her perception was that at this time of great national and international crisis, all our churches are shutting down. And that really bothered me. I've spent a lot of time this week in contact with the Church Council and with other people, thinking about how we keep things going in GCCC. We're not going to get it 100% right, and we'll keep adapting and we'll keep tweaking and we'll keep working, obviously. But here's the thing for all of us. How do we reach out to a world that thinks the church is shutting down? How do we overcome our fears? How do we overcome our distance to connect with people and to connect them to God's love? And I think we need to start that process by knowing God ourselves, being secure in who God is ourselves. When the world changes, when there's upheaval, do we know our God? And as I was thinking this week what I should share today in the light of everything that's happened all through the week, at first it didn't seem right for us just to continue the same programme that we had planned, looking at all these different I ams in John. Things are different, so maybe what we're saying, maybe what we should be looking at is different. And I thought, and I prayed, and I planned, and I thought what we maybe needed was some prayer or something like that, some encouragement from something like Psalms. But as the week went on, I came to the conclusion that actually looking at I am is something that we should be doing. And I came back time and time again to an I am that I hadn't actually planned for us to look at in our teaching programme. It comes right before the passage that we were supposed to look at this week. It's a small but powerful story all about Jesus and his disciples, set in between two much bigger stories, a bigger miracle and a bigger set of teaching. And it occurred to me that this passage can really help us to be secure in God. And from there, to start to share with people that the church isn't shutting down. The church is in fact wide open. So let's take our Bibles, let's turn together and let's read together from John chapter 6. So this is John chapter 6 and we're going to start reading from verse 16. When evening came, the disciples went down to the lake where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. But now it was dark and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realised that only one boat had been there and that Jesus had not entered it with his disciples, but that he had gone away alone. Then some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. Once the crowd realised that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into their boats and went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. This is God's word to us today, and we're thankful for what he has to say to us through his word. Today I want us to take a little bit of time to look at the text of this passage, and then I'm going to just share some of my thoughts on what it means to be an open church, to show the world that the church is open at this time, this very weird and odd time. The first thing that I think we can learn from this passage, or we can take on board from this passage, is that life is ordinary. This story happens the evening after Jesus performs this amazing miracle, the feeding of 5,000 people with just 5 loaves and 2 fish. The crowd, the disciples, everyone has seen Jesus do amazing things. They've seen him do something out of the ordinary. And it's all starting to kick off. The people want to force Jesus to be their king. He doesn't want to dance to their agenda. And according to Mark's account of this story, he sends his disciples back to their base at Capernaum, back to the ordinary stuff in ordinary ways. No miracles, no becoming courtiers of some great heavenly king. Just get in their fishing boats and go home. And in scripture, John tells us when evening came, the disciples went down to the lake where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark and Jesus had not yet joined them. I don't think I need to tell you that life is ordinary. We all go about our everyday things and never really think about them. We have work, we have school, we have uni, we have family, we meet up with friends, we come to church on a Sunday, we meet up with cell group during the week maybe. It's all very ordinary. And we expect that to go on uninterrupted maybe. So did the disciples. Getting into a boat, sailing to another town on the other side of the lake is the most ordinary thing for them to do. They had probably done it 1,000,000 times before. It was their lake. They knew the eddies, they knew the currents, they knew this place. This was ordinary. But then John tells us a strong wind was blowing and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were terrified. This was something unexpected, something that they hadn't anticipated, and it was something dangerous. Now maybe that all starts to sound a bit familiar with what's been going on in this last week and these last months. This time has seen us having to cope with something new and unexpected. This is a virus that we couldn't have anticipated, something which poses a threat to all of us. Now, I don't want to scaremonger. In fact, I'm a fairly calm person in these sorts of circumstances, but we've all seen the impact of the virus across the world on friends and family in China and in Hong Kong, of friends and family here. We've seen people all around the globe affected by this virus. What do we do when those storms hit? How do we react? I think we've seen a lot of different reactions over this last week and before that as well, actually. I think there are people who brazen it out. I don't care what's happening. I'm going to do my thing no matter what anyone says. No one can tell me what to do. There's those sorts of people. Then there are the people who panic and they start to buy enough toilet rolls to bring build a small fortress. They panic, they worry, and they react. But most of all, actually, I think there are people who are afraid. There are different levels of fear that are happening in our world, in our city, in our church just now. We are afraid of this mysterious and invisible virus. They've seen what's happened to people in China and Italy and Spain and in other places. And they're afraid. There are people who are afraid because they lack the resources to stock up on food. Maybe they're old, maybe they have a tight income. They can't do all the panic buying that we've seen lots of people doing recently. There are people who are afraid for their livelihoods and for their jobs. A lot of you have seen and are already feeling the impact of this in the catering trade and in the takeaway business. There are people, I think, who are afraid because they've seen what these circumstances bring out in others. The racism of the last months, the stockpiling, the anger towards one another. I think we're afraid that this is actually what our society looks like. And it's not pretty. There is some pretty stuff going on among the fear, but it's easy to let the fear be the thing that we see. And as the storm blew up, the disciples were frightened, and John tells us they were terrified. And I think their fear came from two places. First of all, I think on a very practical level, the storm frightened them. In what should have been an ordinary boat trip home, something extraordinary and frightening had happened. They were experienced fishermen. They should have been able to cope. But this messed them up. It caught them off guard, and they were frightened. The second thing that frightened them, though, I think, was seeing Jesus. Now, that might sound like a strange thing to say, because surely seeing Jesus would be a source of comfort and not of fear. But Matthew and Mark, who also have this story in their Gospels as well, Matthew and Mark tell us that the disciples, when they saw Jesus, thought that was a ghost that was coming towards them. They thought they had left Jesus behind on the shore. They didn't expect to see him in the middle of the lake, in the middle of the storm, walking on the water towards them. Who would have expected that? Jesus was there, in the middle of the storm, in unexpected ways, so unexpected that the disciples didn't even recognise that it was him. And I think one of the great challenges, but one of the great opportunities of this time, is to look at what's happening and to discern Jesus' presence in it. He is here. He is in the things that are going on. And I think he says the same thing to us as he said to those disciples long ago. He said, "It is I. Do not be afraid." These are the only words of Jesus that are recorded by John in this story. In Matthew and Mark's version, they give us more words. In fact, in Matthew's case, he gives us a lot more words because it's all about Peter getting out of the boat and walking on the water toward Jesus. But for John, there are just 4 words from Jesus. I am, not fear. We translate it, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Jesus says who he is, and he says the trust that we can respond to him with. I am, says Jesus. These same 2 words that we've been thinking about for the last few weeks. I am, exactly the same words. And remember that we found, as we've looked at these words in the last weeks, that for Jesus, I am is not just a description of me, myself. It's using the name of God that God gives himself in Exodus. And we've thought about that over the last few weeks. And walking in the storm, Jesus says, I am. God is present. God is here. The God who created the world and brought order out of the chaos of the water is now walking on chaotic water toward you. Can you see how much reassurance there is in these words of Jesus? When fears overwhelm you, I am. When circumstances are out of control, I am. Do not be afraid, says Jesus. Jesus' reassurance doesn't mean that the storm is going to end or that we'll never go through challenging circumstances. But he can say, and we can trust, do not be afraid, because Jesus, I am, is present. And once we acknowledge Jesus' presence, his real presence, he's not a ghost that's going to disappear. Once we acknowledge his real presence with us, we invite him into our circumstances. That's what the disciples did. So John tells us they were willing, it's an interesting word, they were willing to take Jesus into the boat. And immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. There was something about these circumstances that stopped the disciples from allowing Jesus to be present. Their fear of the circumstances, their fear of who they thought Jesus was, had prevented them from allowing Jesus to join them in what was going on. But as Jesus spoke these words, I am, they recognised the need of his presence with them. They recognised his power over these circumstances, and they welcomed him into the boat with them. I think it's easy, I think it's natural when extraordinary circumstances happen for us to feel vulnerable, for us to feel confused and out of control, and to retreat into ourselves and to try and rely on our own abilities to cope. You know, it's keep calm and carry on. That's been posted all over the internet this week. For sure, we need to be resourceful, we need to be adaptive, we need to be patient with these things that are going on. But first and foremost, we need to invite Jesus into the boat with us. We need to remind ourselves of his presence, of his comfort, of his leading in these circumstances. Jesus says, I am. I am walking through all that is going on toward you. Will you allow me to be with you in the boat? And the other thing I think we need to remember is the storm only lasted a period of time. It wasn't forever. And nor is what's happening now. It feels like it's forever at the moment. It feels like we're under some kind of weird, unknown forever thing. But it's not. This too will pass. It's all very Lord of the Rings, you know. This will pass. This storm will ease. Let's deal with the present, knowing that it's not forever, and knowing that we deal with it with Jesus alongside us. I'd like us to do a little exercise now. I'd like you to get some paper. And now I realise there's a whole lot of people watching this who are panicking and scrabbling around looking for paper. Let's have some paper. Let's get some paper. And I want you just to start jotting down on the paper, anywhere on the paper, some of the fears that you have about now, some of the things that concern you, some of the things that have bothered you about what you've seen in the world or of people or of whatever in this last week, the stormy things of this last week. Just start to jot them down and write them down, even as you feel that they're overwhelming you. Take a moment, take time. We'll pause the video. Once you've written down those things, think on them, reflect on them, pray over them. And in the middle of the piece of paper, in big writing, I'd like you to write, I am. This is your reminder that no matter what, Jesus says, I am. I exist. I'm real. In the storm, in the circumstances, I am. This is the hope that we hold on to, the truth that we live by. And that's why we can respond to the woman I heard in the bank queue with the fact that church is not shutting down. The church isn't shutting up, and people need to know that. They need to know that by how we cope with what's going on, the church is absolutely wide open. And there are 4 things I've thought about that can help us to think about ways that the church is open. First of all, I think the church is open for worship. And by worship, I mean 2 things. Firstly, worship is what we do on a Sunday afternoon as we gather together. Obviously, we can't meet on Sundays for now like we usually do. And that's what my bank queue lady meant by churches shutting down. It's as if Sunday is all that we're about. But in our own ways, we can still worship together. We might not be the slickest outfit in the world. We might not have all the best technology. In fact, I can absolutely guarantee we do not have the best technology in the world. It's been an interesting week for me, figuring out what tech I have or I can borrow. But getting it all smooth and perfect is not what worship is about. We commit ourselves as a community to honouring God, to praising God, to learning from His Word, and doing that with as much togetherness as we possibly can. And we're going to keep doing that over the weeks. It's tempting to say, like the lady, that church is shutting down for a while, so I'll just switch off for a while. Well, that's not the commitment that we make as people who follow Christ and people who love His church. At a time of persecution, in the New Testament, a letter called Hebrews was written. And let me read you from Hebrews 10. Hebrews 10 says, "Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for He who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching." Let's think how we can encourage one another, how we meet together, how we worship together. But worship is much more than what we do on a Sunday afternoon. Worship is a whole life thing. Remember the woman at the well that Jesus met? We thought about her a few weeks ago. God wants worshippers who worship in spirit and in truth. Worship isn't confined to a building, isn't confined to a place. That's what Jesus said to the woman. Worship is what we do with our lives as we honour God, as we serve Him in His world. We have an opportunity now, maybe like we've never had before, to really think about our lives of worship. Are we open to some new ways of doing things, new ways of honouring God as we worship Him with the whole of our lives? The church is open for friendship. One of the things that we've seen over the past week or more has been the number of initiatives that have sprung up, all to do with love and of caring. In the middle of all the negativity, there's been some really loving things going on, and I think that's been wonderful to see. The church doesn't have a monopoly on love, far from it. But I'd love to see God's people not worrying so much about how we do stuff, and just getting on with the business of loving people. Let's not pull up the drawbridge and make sure that we're secure, but get out there with real love. Rebecca's initiative to offer shopping and grocery shopping for people who are self-isolating, for example, that's a way for us to show love, not just to one another, but in the wider community. And as we have less physical contact with one another, remember the ways that we can connect with one another virtually, and use these ways not just to connect with your friends, who you're probably in touch with anyway, but people who you know who are on their own or who are maybe likely to have fewer connections at this time. Think wider than your normal friendships and extend that friendship. I think as a church, we should also be open for fear. Let's be honest, we are feeling fearful, and when we're feeling fearful, fears can bring out the worst in us. We have seen fear bringing out the worst in people in this last week. Fears can make us retreat into ourselves. Fears can make us combative, picking an argument with anyone and everyone. We've seen the very worst of fear in these last few days. Fear makes us think we need far more food supplies than we'll ever need for a year. Fear makes us selfish and self-centred. Fear makes us dig in with our opinions. We should do this, we should do that. They're doing this wrong, they should do it this way. And we stop being willing to listen and to learn with one another. Fear stops us speaking with grace and love into a situation. Fear makes us judge others. Fear even makes us hate others. We need to be open and honest about our fears, for sure. But if the church is open to fear, it's also open to declaring that Christ is with us. And if he is with us, fear does not rule. Christ rules. Our response to what goes on is ruled by Christ and not by our fears. And that's the last thing I want to say. As a church, we can be open for Christ, open for the new things he's doing. Like Jesus walking on water. What new ways can we encounter him? What new things is he drawing us into? Let's not see this as a time to be negative, but as a time to take hold of the new things that God is doing and to get excited about them. I don't know what the next days, weeks, months are going to bring. We're living in quite incredible, quite extraordinary times for the whole world. But I can tell you, in these extraordinary times, there's an opportunity for us as a church to show people that we are wide open. The church isn't shut. Worship isn't cancelled. Worship isn't suspended. We do it every day as we go about our lives. The buildings don't matter. Whether it's Finley Church, whether it's Church Centre, whether it's Partick Trinity Church, these are just locations. Worship is what we do as we honour God and as we serve him and serve his world in these very uncertain days. Jesus says, I am. Don't be afraid.